Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lefarius, and in this week's show, which is our 66th episode, we are taking a look at Qwak. But before we do, let's just jump right into this week's news. First up is something I saw on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. I did promise to mention it, I apologise, but I did forget. However, I thought this was worth sharing. Rocky Bergen over on Twitter has created a fully printable Amiga 500, which you can basically download, print out in colour, and then fold it up so it takes like the place of the desktop unit, matching monitor, and I thought it looked absolutely fantastic. And I did download one. I haven't got a colour printer, I'm afraid, so it was just to try it out, and it looked really good, so it's well worth having a play around with, and I'll stick a link into the show notes. Next up is something I noticed over on Indie Retro News. Basically, someone's released this really good homebrew style shooter using the Stardust engine, which I believe back in the day was this really neat graphical trick which would let you display like 3D roaming tunnels. It was a trick, there was nothing too fancy about it, though I've not seen it used in very many games. And they've called this StarDustWars. Now it only needs a 1 meg Amiga to run the basic 2D edition, which lets you fly an X-Wing through all the famous Star Wars scenes, like out in space obviously. But the beauty of it comes in with the AGA port, which has all of the 3D effects. That's really good because it's got the full background movements. It looks absolutely amazing. It's free to download and play, and because it's been related to like LucasArts and Star Wars, you never know how long that's going to stay up. So again, well worth checking out. Go and check the show notes. Something else I also found on Twitter, someone is creating a It Came From The Desert Cinemaware game. Now this is going to be a full like reimagining of the game, and it's using Unreal style engine graphics, you know, moving around corridors and buildings and things like that. I thought it was worth mentioning as it's always interesting to see Amiga games getting a fresh, more modern look. This was posted way back in December, so it's probably quite a bit onto it now. And I definitely think it's worth keeping an eye on. I'll post a link to the trailer in the notes. You can also follow him on Twitter for updates and notes about it, because his address is @JosCamper, that's JOSCANPER. If you're a fan of the game, you might be annoyed and think, oh, why are they messing with it, making changes? I'm all for stuff like this. It's trying an interesting spin on something we've seen before, and the trailer for it really did impress me, so well worth checking out. Anyway, let's move on to this week's show. Each week when I come to pick a new game to cover and try and come up with ideas about what we should do, I always tend to look at suggestions and popular Amiga games and what I think you guys would be interested in. Because to be honest, I don't really know what I'm doing most of the time. I just pick a lot of these at random, but I do try my best to get your guys' involvement. Now, Qwak is a very funny one. I have no experience with this whatsoever, but I was quite lucky in the sense that when I first bought a CD32, it must have been years and years ago, obviously I've not got one now, this was one of the included games at the time, and I ended up playing quite a lot of it. And even then, the main suggestion for the system as being one of the best games for it was Qwak. So coming back to it all these years later and thinking, what can I do with it today? Is it worth covering? Is there enough here? I'll be honest, I thought it was a bit of a simplistic arcade game and there wasn't much to it. and it wasn't until I actually sat down and started to play it. Well, let's leave that part for the review anyway. But I will say now, I thought this was a big CD32 game, but it turns out it's a lot more than that because it was out on much more than just the console Amiga. It was published by Team 17. It was also developed by them as well. They did games like all of the Alien Breeds. In fact, you probably don't really need me to read out all of their games, but a few of them off the top of my head: Arcade Pool, Project X, Super Stardust, ATR, Super Frog, which we've done. Did we do? Oh, we did the first Alien Breed game. I said that before the series. They were a massive company, as I'm sure you're aware. They did some of the best Amiga games and certainly some of the standout ones that still exist to this day. I only have to mention Worms and it probably sends everyone off on memory lane. They certainly had their hand in some of the biggest and best Amiga game projects, so I was certainly interested to discover this was entirely down to them. At least I thought it was at first. Anyway, it came out in 1993. It was on a single floppy disk. The CD32 version came out a bit later. That was on like a Team 17 budget pack, which also included Alien Breed Special Edition. It was a 2-player game and priced at release at £12.99, so definitely a budget cost there. The CD32 edition was priced at £24.99. Again, it was 2 discs on the same CD, but it didn't include any sort of fancy extra features or any sort of audio improvements. This was as cheap as you could get with a budget version. There was nothing extra to it, sadly. The coding was done by Jamie Woodhouse. He worked on other Team 17 games, things like ATR. There was also Nitro in his history, which I did way back in episode 21. I think that was a Psygnosis game. That is rolling back a fair bit. He also did graphics for the game alongside Richard Heisman, or Headsman, I can't read that. He only ever worked on Qwak there, so I'm not sure what happened. He must have only been delving into Amiga graphic. 2 people worked on the music. First up was the legendary Alistair Brimble. Again, he worked on all of the Alien Breeds, Arcade Pool, the Assassin game, Fantasy World, Dizzy, one of my all-time favourites, Indie Heat, Overdrive, etc, etc. This guy did tons and tons of loads of tunes on lots of different Amiga games. Next up was Bjorn Line, apologies if he ever hears this. He did music for Alien Breed 3D, something called Brat, Driving Force, there's no G on the end of that, how groovy, Project X, Worms, Total Wormage, etc. Again, another one with lots and lots of music behind him. We will be here all day if I list both of these guys' careers. Now, going way back, Jamie Woodhouse first created Qwak for the good old BBC. Now, he ended up selling the rights to it to Superior Software. Now, the BBC Micro was actually where he learned to program. It was also one of my first ever computers. What an amazing machine that was. Now, the Amiga version doesn't actually share any sort of real resemblance to the original game, beyond, of course, the main character being a duck and a few similar collectibles. He just brought the name across really with a few touches here and there, like bits of platforming, that sort of thing. It was certainly not a remake or a sequel or anything that shape and form. He literally just brought the name across. Now, publishers weren't really interested in the game as it stood at the time, and it was only when Jamie was actually showing it to Team 17 over at ECTS, that's the European Computer Trade Show, I believe. I don't know if that thing is even still going. I don't think it is. Maybe it finished in the 90s, I'm not sure. He was showing it to different companies and publishers, trying to get them interested, to take it on, and I suppose it's something for him to sell after all. No one was really interested, but Team 17 saw it, thought it was really interesting, it caught their attention. They were very enthusiastic about taking this on, and they even offered him suggestions on improvements to the actual gameplay before actually signing him up to publish for it. It's certainly not like that anymore, where all these big games and companies are these massive armies of different people and you've got to go through God knows what sort of contracts. This is the high life of when you could just mail games in or actually show up at company doors and show off what you'd done, and if they were impressed enough, a very good chance that you could have published something. Now, I am sure I have missed out loads of details there, though sadly this is just about all I could find out. I did read several reviews about it. It's a very brief tale, and it just shows what the actual market and publishers were like at the time. Now, comparisons between this and another arcade game, Bubble Bobble, are made quite often, and I even see this online a fair bit. But Jamie Woodhouse isn't even sure that he actually played it at the time, so he's not saying he was inspired by it, though it's possible he had played it and got some ideas from there. He's not entirely sure, nobody knows for sure, though they are similar, so don't start jumping up and down thinking, oh, you just copied that straight over. I don't think it was like that at all. It was a budget release and it was extremely successful, so much so in fact that they decided to re-release it as part of the CD32 bundle I mentioned earlier, and much later onto the Game Boy Advance. I was amazed to discover that there's actually a modern day PC port which is still available over on Qwak.co.uk, and it's for around £5 or $6 I think if you're outside of the UK, which Jamie says is the most definitive version of the game available. And if you like the sound of the game from what I'm going to talk about today, then by all means please pop along to the website, I'm sure you would appreciate it. The game itself was ported to iOS, originally Apple Macintosh, the BBC Micro, again that's not really the same sort of thing, is it? The Game Boy Advance, again as I've said, and the PC, but the main version, the original version where it's all at, is the Amiga one. There is a story for this, of course, in the manual. I will just read it out. 2 ducks are better than 1, so they say, although we're not quite sure who it was that said it in the first place. The point is that games this good rarely need a story, and this one is no different. It's a tale of 2 ducks and their travels through 8 amazing worlds, packed with delightful rewards, bonuses and more. But dark forces are at work and a duck's life is a hard life. A good job really, because a good game needs seriously bad guys. We know this is a very poor excuse for a story, but it doesn't really matter, so stop reading this and get playing. This has got to be the most open and honest game intro story I've ever seen in a very long time. The first stage when you begin is a very nice introduction. All of the levels throughout this game are on a single screen. There's no multiple options or going through doors to go through different parts of stages. No, it's one screen at a time. It's very much like your classic arcade games of old. Now, when you begin, there are lots and lots of enemies following very set patterns around the screen. There's plenty of fruit placed around with platforms to bounce and practice and effectively to learn how to play. It's a bit annoying, I suppose, when you keep coming back to replay the game, because it doesn't take too long, luckily enough, though it's always the same thing when it begins. Anyway, the duck himself, he sadly and weirdly has no name, is the size of a small cube, with enemies to match as well. They all follow that same set pattern there, with green feathers and red shoes. Now, he is by no means the coolest of mascots, and this is mascot territory, of course, when everybody was going crazy for them, but he's very cutesy in his own way and always reminds me of Orville the Duck. Now, if you're outside of the UK, you've probably no idea who that is. I wouldn't even go and look it up because it's far too risky from what you'd actually see. Now, the game itself, there is no HUD to speak of. So things like lives, gems, points, etc. are shown in between the actual stages, which is a very odd choice, I'm sure you'll agree as we go on. Now, on the controls, nice and simple. Up is used for jump, with fire to sling an egg, though it's always in a limited number. Despite being a duck, he cannot lay these things like crazy, so you have to be very careful through the game to actually save them for much bigger enemies that pop up on the screens. Now, movement is fairly quick, it's very responsive, and it did remind me of controlling Bubble Bobble, and I can easily understand why the two games are actually compared. You know, it's very similar in style with the size of the sprites and that single screen and the way they move around through the different parts of the platforms. Now, enemies on the screen can't actually pass through any collectibles that are lying around on the floors, which in turn makes you consider whether to collect and free the baddies from behind, like where they're wandering about in the set pattern until it's safe, or take the risk and like open a little cave and then they push out into further bits of the level. It increases the risk as you actually explore. There is loads of fruit on the actual screen, which can also increase your eggs that you've got lying about. Gems are littered in hard to reach spots, and the idea is if you collect 6 of these in a level, you will get a bonus. There are plenty of power-ups which take the place of potions to collect. Now you get an option of things like Levitate, which has got like this weird helicopter hat that's very much like Adam's Family. Armor, and he does actually don a suit of armor. This is a very odd game. Double damage, nice and simple. Some invincibility thrown in there. Stronger eggs that you can actually fire, and chocolate ones, which just look very brown to me, and I wasn't sure what they actually did, but they're in there anyway, so it makes for an entertaining thing to collect. There are so many collectibles throughout each of the levels. I would probably spend half an hour listing them out, but you've got things like keys, lockpicks, gates, skulls, flowers, mushrooms, extra eggs, oil, glue, bulbs, bubbles to jump on, pipes thrown in there. You know, I need to take a deep breath just to get through the rest of this list. It's absolutely massive with the huge number of things to pick up and explore. And again, this is just a single screen game, so as you can probably imagine already, it's absolutely packed with content. There are far too many stages to actually count. There's tons and tons in there, but they are divided up into sections of around 10 each, which each have their own background, so you're effectively moving from world to world with several lumps of levels lumped into them. So there's lots of different colours with things like moons and space backgrounds, the jungle later on, Egypt's in there, snowy backgrounds with slippery platforms, etc. It's absolutely massive, and the number of different levels that are all based around these themes, it would probably take you hours to get through all of them. The point of each stage is to collect enough to open the exit doors, but even those actually change appearance to match the current world. So like in the jungle it might be, say, a cave, in space it'd be something high-tech, that sort of a thing. It's nice and simple. Now it means that the entirety of each level is effectively a mad dash to collect as much as possible, score as many points as you can, snag the keys for the door, and then make your escape. At the start of each stage, you're actually given this little text hint to sort of give you a clue about what the level's about or what to do. Some are just references to other games, there's a few jokes thrown in there, it's quite entertaining, but most serve as clues for what you need to do for the stage ahead. Some of the stages have things like counters where it rains stuff like spikes or collectibles. It's a mad dash to move back and forward to either not get hit or to grab as many points as you can. Now, if you've played Bubble Bobble before, you will instantly recognise the graphical style of this straight away. It's very, very bright, breezy and very colourful. It looks like an explosion of rainbows. There's just too many colours, it's everywhere, and I just can't think of any other Amiga game that has got this level of colour and intensity. It's just insane. There are plenty of traps throughout the entire game with things like ice floors, I think I said that earlier. You get to slide around, your typical thing in platformers, collapsible walls and floor tiles that dissipate as you run over. It makes for some real mad dashes throughout the game. You always have to keep on moving quickly, and it never lets up with this sort of weird level of intensity in this arcade game style gameplay. The enemies mainly consist of teddy bears, fish, hippos even, ghosts in there to name most of them actually, though there are also bosses or guardians as the actual game calls them, though these are just resized versions of the normal enemies which just take more egg shots, which is why you've got to save them throughout as you're wandering through. Having said that though, you do sort of get reset when you go from stage to stage. They also look around about 6 times the size of your standard enemies and effectively you, so they are quite big and they move around the levels quite a fair bit. And often the levels themselves are designed with platforms around them, so you can either trap them in corners or use your eggs to take them out. It's some very, very clever tricks within the platforms. Now, this is not a highly difficult game when you first start out. The early parts of it you can get through quite quickly. Again, this is only a single screen game, so it means it's very addictive, it's very arcadey. It always makes you want to keep on playing endlessly. Now, the later stages, the further on you get, they can be very, very hard. And it has a good, steady learning curve, even for me, because I managed to get quite far and I had a lot of fun actually exploring the levels as I was going. It even has a 2-player mode where you actually get to jump on top of each other's heads and shove your partners off platform. So it's sort of like mad fighting thrown in there, and it does add a whole new curve to the 2-player that the single player just doesn't have. There's lots and lots of different music throughout, and it does make a nice change through the levels, as it's not just the same old tune on constant repeat, which was a lot of Amiga games were doing at the time. Now, there's plenty of arcade sort of sound effects for things like firing, collecting objects and taking out the enemies. Not to forget the burps that are placed throughout the game. This has it all with the sound effects. Now, none of it sounds out of place to actually what's happening on screen, and Qwak really did make me feel like I was playing an actual arcade game. And I can understand why this was such a huge hit on the CD32, because it is the perfect arcadey console game. The game, of course, does have its problems, and we will go through them. Now, first off, you can drop off the actual screen from the actual ceiling at the top, and then, you come through the bottom and you jump through the top, but you can't actually go left or right. This is even though the actual walls aren't blocked. There's nothing in the way to stop you. It's just like it's a clear run through, and you think, oh, I should be able to go from left to right. Now, it's something that you do actually get used to, but I would have actually liked a bit more freedom with it there, because there's a few times, I think it's like instinct, I just want to be, it's like that Pac-Man effect, there's a door there, you want to go through it. There's a missing section, I want to wander from one screen to the other side. It just doesn't happen, sadly. Nothing major, it doesn't really affect or spoil the game in any way, shape or form. It's just the way my brain works, I think, and it was sort of like this non-visible wall that's always there, and I kept thinking, oh, I'll just go this way. Oh, I can't, I've got to go back and platform through everything else to go back to a different part of the screen. There's also no HUD on the screen, and I will say I'm not entirely sure why. I suspect it was just down to coding and to keep things out of the way. So there's no scores or lives, and I think at times that could actually be quite useful. A lot of the time, I suppose you don't really need them. There was a few occasions where you're facing off against like the Guardians, and I was like, oh god, have I got 2, 3, 4, that sort of a thing. And I don't want to be worrying about that whilst I'm dashing around through dead quickly through these stages. It could have just been there off in the corner. And I found, almost like instinct, I kept looking at the top or the bottom of the screen just to check, and it wasn't there. Just a tiny little annoyance for me, really. You might be fine with this, maybe used to that on other different games. The CD32 edition, strangely, just doesn't do anything extra. It's a real shame, as it could have really benefited with lots more things like more levels, extra bonuses, different bosses, different enemies even. There was a big opportunity to do something special there, and they just missed it and just didn't do it. And it's not a major problem, but it's a bit annoying, because for me, I just want more. And for me, the CD32 versions of Amiga games are always the best ones I've found. And, they've got the most improvements because they had all that CD space. I'm sure they were just pushed for time, and it was a double budget pack though. It's just a shame. Biggest issue with the game has to be the main character. Is he actually meant to be Orville? I just don't know. Why doesn't he even have a name? Are these even problems? I'm really struggling to pick faults, so we're already done with this part of the review. So let's move over to the magazine scores. Now, Amiga Computing gave this a 92%, Amiga Power 88%, The One, the same again, 88%, CU Amiga, 87%, and Amiga Action 79%, which I think was by far the lowest, though in general that was very high praise across all of the magazines. Most of them had next to no problems with it, they absolutely loved it, and even when it came out as the budget version, of the CD32 budget version, they loved it all again. It was a bargain double pack that, you've got Alien Breed there, then you've got Qwak. They are as good as a compilation could be for gameplay. As a whole, this game, before I actually played it properly, always reminded me of Blicky over on the Sega Mega Drive Genesis. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's actually played that, though it's like a scrolling game where you move from left to right and the screen moves with you, and you just have to collect these like little ducklings. And it always stands out in my mind as being, actually, it's almost like it is that game. Very, very odd thing to think of, but I've always confused these two over the years. So I'm really glad I've managed to sit down now and play this properly and sink some decent time of it, because I'm never going to mistake those two again. This is completely different. One of its biggest pluses is I could not believe just how quickly it all moves around. It's extremely fast, it's very, very frantic, there's so much colour and things to collect. The levels just fly by, and sometimes I literally had to pause the game, take a breather and just sit back and rest, just feel, oh my god, what the hell is getting on? Maybe I'm just getting old. Games like this live or die by the controls, and Qwak just doesn't disappoint. It moves like a dream, and if you die, it's always your own fault. It's never down to the controls. It's not because, you're fighting with the controller or trying to remember which button you should be pressing. Usually, I find I just don't like up the jump. I prefer, having a button to press. Down to personal preference, though I always struggle these days when I go back to the Amiga games and I find I have to be doing it. But with this, it feels natural almost, much easier than just tapping, say, a single button off to the side. Now, I've read comments about this being a bit too much like a public domain game, but the graphics and sound are certainly a cut above the rest, especially at the time. This feels very, very special. It makes for the perfect budget titles, and I'd have been very happy back in the day to buy it as a kid. Hell, you can still get a PC copy now, and by all means go and pick a copy up. People have been recommending this to me for years, but I never really saw the appeal in it. Playing the game, I realised I've been a bit of an idiot, because it really is a hidden Amiga gem. No wonder it's one of the CD32's most highly rated games. It's great, almost arcade perfection. And I just wish that they'd done a bit more on the CD32 edition, because I just want more of it. I want more of this game. This is one that's ranked right up there and definitely deserves the AMIGArama Recommended Award. Just go right out there and play it, because it's loads of fun. And sadly, it's time to draw the show to a close. If you've liked today's show at all and you'd like to leave some sort of comment, you can pop along to AMIGArama.com and have a look at the episode, or even follow us on Facebook, which is facebook.com/AmigaRama, or come along to the Twitter account, which is @AmigaRamaPod. I'm posting there on a regular daily basis. There's always some new game or cover or art or something that we're talking about. It's always worth checking out. Of course, we need to take a moment to thank all of our Patreon supporters, and they are Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Figgy CTZ, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Retro Rabbit, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. I'm still amazed that so many of the listeners want to actually help out with the show, and this is the best way to do it. If you feel you can give anything, then just pop along to patreon.com/AmigaRama, or if you can't, then please leave us an iTunes review. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.